Coming up in our newscast tonight. The two Koreas and the United Nations Command held talks about plans for the joint security area. Other than formulating surveillance rules as the three sides continue to meet, Korean visitors could soon be able to cross over the military demarcation line freely. On Thursday in New York, America's top diplomat Mike Pompeo and Kim Yong-chol, the head of North Korea's United Front Department, is set to meet for discussions, and they will touch on denuclearization and implementing the June 12th summit declaration. When Washington granted Seoul a waiver from the latest U.S. sanctions on Iran, it meant there will be a stable supply of oil flowing into South Korea. However, some experts are concerned about possible repercussions, including rising oil prices. NEWSCENTER begins now. It's 8 p.m. here in Korea, live from our studio in Seoul. This is Arirang News Center. Welcome to our program. Daniel Choi. Military officials from the two Koreas and the United Nations Command held talks today about plans for the joint security area. During the session, they agreed to come up with a set of joint surveillance rules, which could eventually lead to allowing visitors to freely cross the border. Kan Young-woo has our top story.
People from the two Koreas may soon be able to walk freely across the border at the joint security area for the first time in over 4 decades. Military officials from the two Koreas and the UN command held a three-way meeting on Tuesday at the Freedom House on the South Korean side of the border village of Panmunjom. According to Seoul's defense ministry, they agreed to draw up rules of interaction for the security personnel that either side stations in the other's area. Having personnel on both sides was part of September's military agreement. Seoul's defense ministry said that they will come up with a final draft of the rules in the near future through the exchange of documents. The three sides evaluated the disarmament that took place in late October, inspecting the newly built guard posts at the entrances to the southern and northern sides. The three sides also took a look at both Korea's surveillance equipment and how it's run, discussing ways to adjust it and share information. Once everything's set up, not only foreign tourists but also Korean visitors will be allowed to cross freely over the military demarcation line from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. There are 35 soldiers in the JSA, including 5 officers each from south and north for surveillance purposes. They no longer carry firearms and now wear yellow armbands that read Panmunjom Civil Police. Tuesday's delegations were led by South Korean Army Colonel Jo Yong-gun, North Korean Army Colonel Chang-nam, and the U.S. Army Colonel Burke Hamilton. Kan Young-woo, Arirang News.
South Korea has found 2 more sets of remains at the demilitarized zone while clearing landmines from an old battlefield. According to Seoul's defense ministry on Tuesday, they were found at Arrowhead Hill, the site of the bloodiest battles of the Korean War involving the troops from the two Koreas and the UN. Both of the bodies are presumed to be the remains of the soldiers who fought there. They will be sent to the forensics team for further identification. That makes a total of 4 bodies recovered at the DMZ, including 2 found last month, ahead of a project next year in which Seoul and Pyongyang will search for war remains together. And we finally have a date set for a high-level meeting between Pyongyang and Washington Thursday in New York. That's when Kim Yong-chol, the North Korean leader's top aide, will sit down for talks with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Oh Jung-hee tells us more.
Some 5 months after the Singapore summit, North Korea and the United States are finally due to hold high-level talks. The U.S. State Department says Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Kim Yong-chol, the head of Pyongyang's United Front Department, the intelligence agency, will meet in New York on Thursday to discuss denuclearization and the implementation of the June 12th summit declaration. It's expected the steps North Korea promised to take to denuclearize and U.S. actions in return will top the agenda. Meeting with South Korean President Moon Jae-in, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un promised to invite international experts to oversee the permanent dismantlement of its Dongchangri missile engine test site. Kim Jong-un also expressed a willingness to also scrap the Yongbyon nuclear test site for good if Washington takes corresponding measures. The tug-of-war continued for the past couple of months on what those corresponding measures should be and whether U.S. should actually take those actions. Pyongyang first called for an end to the Korean War and has now shifted its focus to lifting sanctions, but the U.S. is firm that sanctions will remain in place until North Korea denuclearizes. And Pompeo has recently reconfirmed that denuclearization ends when the U.S. verifies it. With the high-level talks now set in stone, it's also expected that these talks could involve figures who are to lead the working-level talks as well. The State Department announced that Stephen Biegun, U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, is taking part. And according to Tokyo-based Kyodo News Agency, the U.S. has asked Choi Sun-hee, the North's Vice Foreign Minister, to be present as well. They were supposed to meet much earlier upon a U.S. suggestion in September, but that fell flat as North Korea did not respond. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
When Kim Yong-chol meets Pompeo in New York, South Korea's presidential office expects they'll take on not only denuclearization, but also issues like establishing formal diplomatic relations. That's coming from the spokesperson for the Cheongwade, who noted that the State Department mentioned that the duo would be discussing the 4 pillars of the joint statement adopted in Singapore. 2 of those pillars are establishing lasting peace on the Korean peninsula and diplomatic relations between Seoul and Washington. The South Korean government is breathing a sigh of relief this morning after it was confirmed that the U.S. has granted Seoul a waiver from the latest U.S. sanctions on Iran. This means that for now, South Korea is free to import oil from Iran without fear of economic repercussions from Washington. Lee Ji-won tells us more.
With the 180-day grace period coming to an end on Monday, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin announced the return of U.S. sanctions on Iran.
We are making it abundantly clear to the Iranian regime that they will face mounting financial isolation until they fundamentally change their destabilizing behavior. These powerful sanctions directly target Iran's banking, energy, and shipping sectors.
Pompeo said 8 countries would be granted waivers from the sanctions as they had significantly reduced their purchases of Iranian crude over the past 6 months.
We have decided to issue temporary allotments to a handful of countries, responsive both to the specific circumstances and to ensure a well-supplied oil market. The U.S. will be granting these exemptions to China, India, Italy, Greece, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Turkey.
The waivers will last up to 180 days, but are extendable. Seoul's Foreign Affairs Ministry says the decision means South Korea will be able to maintain a stable supply level of Iranian condensate or ultralight oil, but exact figures were not disclosed. South Korea heavily depends on Iranian oil. An official at the ministry said over half of the country's daily imports of condensate barrels last year were from Iran. Seoul is also free to maintain its current financial transactions with Iran's sanctioned central bank. The 2 countries have been trading oil and other products by paying and receiving Korean won through the Iranian central bank's accounts at 2 South Korean banks. Since South Korea's currency has low convertibility, the official said, the negotiating team assured the U.S. that this method of transaction will not allow U.S. dollars or other foreign currencies to flow into Iran. The U.S. sanctions on Tehran comes as the Trump administration withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran in May, saying it had not stopped Iran from developing its ballistic missile program and intervening in neighboring countries. While Pompeo said more than 20 importing nations have already zeroed out their imports of Iranian crude, he warned the U.S. will continue negotiations to get all of the nations to zero. Lee Ji-won, Arirang News.
Iran has the 4th largest proved crude oil reserves in the world. One of its biggest customers is Seoul, so naturally Washington's decision to exempt South Korean firms from U.S. sanctions on Tehran was welcome news. However, one question still lingers. Is the country safe from the overall impact of the measures? Oh Se-young turned to some experts for their take on the matter.
Seoul's Trade Ministry expects a stable supply of oil flowing into the country, as South Korean companies trading with Iran were granted temporary exemptions from Washington's sanctions on Tehran. Vice Minister of Trade Chung Seung-il told a meeting of energy business leaders on Tuesday that many uncertainties have now been eased due to the waivers. He expressed relief that Korean banks are able to maintain won-based transactions with Tehran Central Bank, not just for oil imports but also for products that aren't subject to sanctions. However, the exemptions only last up to 180 days, and local experts are divided on how this could affect South Korea's economy. Some say the sanctions will lead to a drop in global oil supply, which would inevitably raise oil prices. Such a price hike would hurt South Korea in particular, given its heavy dependence on Iranian crude. Goldman Sachs estimates that Iranian crude exports will fall to 1.15 million barrels a day by the end of the year, down from 2.5 million barrels in mid-2018.
In 2017, Iran was the third largest provider of crude oil to South Korea when comparing imports. Saudi Arabia was the biggest and Kuwait second. U.S. sanctions on Iran might lead to energy supply problems in South Korea.
Meanwhile, some say impact will be limited, as there are alternative producers to choose from.
Other oil-producing countries such as Saudi Arabia or Iraq are likely to increase production. They can boost their exports and make up for any shortages from Iran.
While showing optimism over the recent developments, Vice Minister Chung raised the need for coordination with Washington to iron out further uncertainties regarding its embargo on Iran. He added that there would be support for South Korean firms that are affected by the sanctions, as well as measures to help small and medium companies diversify their export markets. Oh Seong, Arirang News.
The South Korean economy is facing grim prospects for this year and next, mainly due to faltering employment and competitiveness of local businesses. Growing uncertainties from intensifying trade protectionism also pose major risks. Kim Ji-yeon fills us in on the Korea Development Institute's forecast.
State-run think tank, the Korea Development Institute, in a report on Tuesday, lowered its forecast for the Korean economy this year by 0.2 percentage points from its previous estimate to 2.7%, the lowest level since 2012. It also projected the Korean economy to grow 2.6% next year, which is 0.1 percentage points lower than its previous figure released during the first half of this year. The report cited growing economic uncertainties as the main culprit, including a slowdown in private investment, sluggish employment, and piling household debt, currently estimated at around $1.3 trillion. The report pointed out the government's expansionary fiscal measures, although needed, have limited impact in strengthening the competitiveness of local businesses, which is essential for local economic recovery. The report says although the country's exports are expected to continue booming through next year, risks are expanding due to an intensifying trade battle between China and the U.S., as well as the long-term effects of trade protectionist measures. It advised the government to continue pursuing monetary easing measures since core inflation, which excludes volatile food and oil prices, is in the low 1% range. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
The Bank of Korea has released its preliminary data on the country's current account balance for September. It represents all the country's transactions with the rest of the world, including trade in goods and services. Once again, a surplus was logged thanks to strong exports of semiconductors. Go Ryuni breaks down the digits for us.
Korea's current account surplus in September surpassed the $10 billion mark for the first time in a year. It was also the 79th monthly surplus in a row. That's 6.5 years running. A positive current account balance means that a country is a net lender to the rest of the world. According to the Bank of Korea on Tuesday, the surplus was $10.83 billion. The surplus in the goods account also posted a yearly record high. That was despite exports and imports both declining on year in September due to the Chuseok holiday, which meant fewer working days, but the Bank of Korea said exports remain strong overall.
Exports in the goods account in September decreased by 5.5% on year due to fewer business days. But the daily average was up 13.8% on the back of increasing world trade volume and good performance in semiconductors and petroleum goods.
Exports of semiconductors increased by almost 28% on year, and shipments of petroleum products rose by almost 15%. The Bank of Korea says the current account for this year is likely to hit the $70 billion surplus that it forecast back in October. But the BOK added that it needs to keep a close eye on future global trade uncertainties. Experts say a nation's current account is related to other economic indicators.
When the current account marks a surplus, it means that a country can prevent an exchange rate surge. If the currency is stable, prices can be kept relatively stable as well.
The service account remained in the red, marking a deficit of $2.52 billion for the month. Last September, the deficit was $2.88 billion, an improvement that came from the transport and travel accounts. 고르니, Arirang News.
The National Assembly held an audit of the presidential office today. The opposition slammed the government's income-led growth policies, claiming they've been slowing down the economy. They added that it seems as though the presidential office doesn't understand the severity of the economic situation. The opposition bloc also took issue with the visit by the presidential chief of staff to the demilitarized zone to oversee landmine removal while the president was on an overseas trip, saying that he shouldn't have left the presidential office vacant. They also criticized the presidential office for leaking the location of an entrance to a South Korean guard post by uploading footage of the DMZ visit, for which the top office apologized. The ruling party, meanwhile, was a shield for the presidential office, but they also emphasized the need for the government to step up their communication with the opposition bloc to get their understanding on important matters. For the second straight day, the National Assembly's Budget Committee deliberated the government's spending plans for next year's worth some $420 billion. Rival lawmakers again clashed over the specifics of the proposal, especially the record $20 billion set aside for job creation. The ruling party stressed that it's needed to address the poor job market conditions and that the figure compared to Korea's GDP is below the OECD average. However, the opposition demanded a sharp cut, saying that the Moon administration has already spent some $48 billion to create new jobs, but it hasn't made conditions any better. Another area the rival parties are at odds over is the $890 million set for inter-Korean projects, while the ruling party said the budget needs to be increased since it was a similar size even when the two Koreas were not on good terms. The opposition says progress on denuclearization must come first. Last week, Tokyo's government said it cannot accept the South Korean Supreme Court's ruling that a Japanese company has to pay compensation to Koreans forced to work for it during World War II. Lawyers and scholars in that country are now pointing out Tokyo's stance as unhelpful and that forced labor is an issue of human rights. Seo Bo-bin has the full story.
Over 100 Japanese lawyers and scholars have issued a statement criticizing the Japanese government's response to the South Korean Supreme Court's decision on the compensation for forced labor. Attorneys Shiro Kawakami and Seita Yamamoto announced on Tuesday a joint statement together with 100 other lawyers and scholars at the Tokyo House of Councilors, stating that the issue of compensation for victims of forced labor is a human rights issue, and any agreement that doesn't satisfy the victims or nations involved is not a helpful solution. The statement also said that individual rights to claim under the Korea-Japan Jurisdiction Agreement have not been terminated, and that Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's claim that individuals' rights to compensation had been completely resolved is misleading. It also said Japanese companies that are sued in South Korea over the issue should provide more support for the victims. But Japanese Congressman Yasuhisa Shiozaki, who visited Korea's National Assembly, said he cannot accept the decision since it involves overturning the legal basis of the relationship between Korea and Japan, and said that Seoul should correct what he says is a violation of international law. Seo Bo-bin, Arirang News.
Americans are casting their ballots to choose who will represent them in Congress. While the polls don't provide a clear picture of what might happen just yet, we can find out how the different outcomes could affect the Trump administration's North Korea policy. Here's Park Hee-jun to help us do just that.
These midterm elections in the U.S. are particularly important for the Korean Peninsula, as the outcome is directly linked to the future direction of nuclear negotiations with North Korea. Right after the elections, North Korea and the U.S. will hold high-level talks to make progress on the North's denuclearization and sort out the details of a second summit between North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and U.S. President Donald Trump planned for early next year. so the midterms are of immediate concern for the Korean Peninsula. There are 4 possible scenarios, but the latest poll suggests the most probable one is where Republicans maintain control of the Senate and Democrats win back the House. According to one expert for South Korea, that outcome would complicate the ongoing peace drive, including inter-Korean cooperation projects. The Trump administration will lose some of its political clout to push through the president's plans to engage the North.
I think the human rights issue will be raised by the Democrats, and also more pressure on North Korea will be raised by Democrats in the Congress, which is contradictory to the President Trump's policy, which is negotiation. So all in all, I think President Trump will be, isolated positions by Congress as far as the North Korea policy is concerned.
And so there may be a change of pace, but a different expert doesn't expect much to change from the status quo, even if Democrats regain control of Congress.
Obviously, from next year going on, the United States is going to go into election period in the second half of the year. So probably leading up to that point, the first half, we might see a little stalemate and postponing everything, every process, and try to keep everything under control and manageable.
President Trump will have to seek support from Democrats for a successful outcome with North Korea, but ultimately it comes down to President Trump's response, whether he will push for dialogue with the regime and its denuclearization as he has up until this point. Park Hee-jun, Arirang News.
The goal of open government partnership is to improve citizen participation in politics. This week in Seoul, the OGP held its first Asia-Pacific regional meeting for 2018. Yoon Jung-min sheds light on some of the key discussion topics.
As more and more citizens around the world are taking an active part in politics, reformers are looking for ways to ensure dialogue between governments and society. The Open Government Partnership Asia-Pacific Regional Meeting 2018 takes place in Seoul on Monday and Tuesday, with participants discussing ways to promote citizens' involvement in political decisions. This year's OGP meeting was jointly organized by South Korea's Interior and Safety Ministry. Some 600 participants, including government officials, lawmakers, professors, and citizens, discussed ways to promote democracy. The Korean government also shared its efforts toward an open government.
After inauguration, our government opened Gwanghwamun First Street, a communication platform for citizens at Gwanghwamun Square. Some 1.2 million citizens proposed 180,000 policies over a 100-day period.
This year's meeting also encompasses other democratic issues, including raising public access to the legal system, improving governance to improve the quality of life, and fighting against corruption.
With the idea that if you carefully listen to what citizens have to say, what they want out of government, and you respond to that as a government, you get better government, a more effective government, more credible government.
People with technology and IT infra. So open data and e-government is providing the resources and the platform for citizen participation in their own way.
The Open Government Partnership hopes this year's meeting will provide more practical advice for citizen engagement in politics. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
If you're in the nation, brace yourself for extremely high levels of fine dust this week. The government announced emergency measures to be taken on Wednesday in the Seoul metropolitan area from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. local time, including restrictions on driving and on power plants. The measures will affect the capital, Incheon, and most of Gyeonggi-do province. Tomorrow, public sector workers in those areas will only be allowed to drive a car to work if its license plate ends in an odd number. Thermal power plants that emit fine dust will only run at 80% capacity. Also, street sweepers will clean the roads and subway stations more frequently. Time to turn to Michelle Bach at the Weather Center for the updates you need. Michelle, more places are being issued with ultra-fine dust alerts.
That's right, Daniel. Currently, the capital and Chungcheongnam-do province are under ultra-fine dust advisories. Now, the alarming dust levels have prompted emergency measures to be taken in the central region tomorrow, so please be advised and take precautions. Now, with the dusty air, East Asia, including Korea, will generally have a cloudy Wednesday afternoon. But until then, there's going to be overnight showers until the morning. Seoul starting the day with 9 degrees Celsius and Daegu and Gyeongju both at 10 degrees. The mercury will climb up to 14 over in Seoul tomorrow. Busan and Jeju are a lot warmer at 19 and 20 degrees. The nationwide rain on Thursday should clear out the air. I'll leave you with the weather conditions around the world.
This is where we have to wrap things up. Wherever you may be tuning in from, thank you for staying with us.